Works. We're a performance maintenance tuning center here in Atlanta, Georgia. We do all kinds of works, mostly on race bikes, but we do street bikes and metric cruisers also. But I find myself answering the same questions over and over again with different customers. So I want to start a video series talking about things we do and how we do them and why we do them. And that way you can look them up and learn before you ever even come to the shop. So the first one I'd like to talk about is piggyback fuel controllers. The most common one that you see are Power Commander or Pizzazz. How they work, why you put them on, and how we tune them. So this is my dyno room. This is where most of it happens at. This is a DynoJet 250i dyno. And I use this to create custom tuning maps. I'll explain to you what that is and how a Power Commander works. Alright, you probably notice I keep saying Power Commander. And when I say Power Commander, what I actually mean is a piggyback fuel controller. It piggybacks onto the bike's ECU. We're going to cover all that and we'll talk a little bit about the difference in flashing. But first off, the most basic part of all of it is this triangle. Air, fuel, spark, or an ignition source. You have to have these three things to light something off. And that's what you're doing in the cylinders. You're lighting off the air and fuel ratio. So with that, part of it is very important. This air and fuel has to come in at a ratio. And that's the ratio we use. 13.2 parts air to 1 part fuel. So for every made up thing, ounce of fuel that goes in, 13.2 ounces of air has to go in to make the ratio that burns correctly. If it's too rich, it burns too slow. If it's too lean, it burns with a bang. So the correct ratio actually just expands really quickly to push the piston down. So that's the ratio that we're trying to go, and that's an arguable ratio. People go as high as 13.8, 14.1, areas like that. But 13.2 off of an O2 reading is what we try to judge. So the parts of your bike that control air and fuel and spark all start with the ECU, electronic control unit. It's the brains of your bike. But it has to listen to a lot of sensors on the bike to understand what's going on. Things like throttle position sensor, manifold air pressure, ambient air pressure. These two being the most important because it can take the ambient air pressure, subtract manifold air pressure, and determine how much air is going into the bike. And since we're trying to make a ratio, it knows how much air, it's going to know how much fuel to put in. But it still modifies even further based on gear position, RPM, even things like the clutch switch. All those determine what's going to come out of the ECU in regards to fuel and spark. So what it does is it takes all this information and then kind of pretend that there's a really big book in the ECU. So what it says is, okay, at this manifold air pressure, at this ambient air pressure, in this gear, at this throttle, at this RPM, at this temperature, I'm going to send this much fuel to the fuel injector. And I'm going to light the spark. This is a spark plug, if you believe it or not. I'm going to light the spark at X degrees before top dead center. So information in, control out. Problem is, book's wrong. The reason the book's wrong is because it dumbs the bike down in low gears for emissions. It leans the bike out in low gears for emissions. You may have put a different exhaust on your bike, a different air filter, different cams. Everything you bolt onto your bike is to make air flow better. And as you get more air going through, you have to introduce more fuel. But it's basing all of these decisions on the bike as it came off the showroom floor. You've already changed all that. So how do you get the air-fuel ratio correct for your bike when the book's wrong? And that's when you get a piggyback controller like a Power Commander or a Pizzazz. And what those do is, and the reason that they're called piggyback is because the bike doesn't know that they're there. So we're going to talk about a Power Commander 5. Power Commander 5 does tap into throttle position and it taps into RPM. And then what it does is it intercepts the signal going to the fuel injector. So ECU looks at all this information and says, hey, at all of this, let's send this much fuel. Power Commander intercepts that signal, and through the use of a map based on RPM and throttle position, it says, hey, we're at 100% throttle at 14,000 RPMs. I need to add 8% more fuel. So it intercepts this signal, adds 8% to the duty cycle, which is what is controlling the fuel injector, and it squirts in that much fuel, 8% more at that particular range, depending on what your map is. Different RPMs, different changes, sometimes negative, sometimes positive. And we'll cut here with the generator. So I'm going to show you what's inside of a Power Commander. Like we talked about, it's based on throttle position and RPM. This is what it looks like inside. This is the map. The reason it's called a map is because if you did it in 3D, you'd have throttle position, RPMs, and then pluses think of coming up and negatives is going down. So it ends up making a terrain, a map. This is a downloaded map. And the way downloaded maps are made is they take your bike, not your bike, but a bike exactly like your bike, and then the exhaust manufacturer sends them an exhaust, they install the exhaust, they put it on a dyno. All this occurs at Power Commander Dynojet in North Las Vegas, Nevada. And they run the bike and they create this map. So what I tell people is downloaded maps are like off-the-shelf clothing. It says 34-34, but sometimes it's a little tight, sometimes it's a little loose, different ones fit different ways. So downloaded maps are great. They're your size, they're made for your bike. But sometimes they're a little loose, sometimes they're a little rich. They're not specifically made for you. What a custom map is it's a custom tailored suit. We make the same thing they make in general, but specifically for your bike. And the way we do that is with the dyno. Put your bike on the dyno, hook up an RPM lead, and use the sniffers over there to sniff the exhaust through an O2 sensor so that we can tell whether your bike's running rich or lean. And since we know what RPM it's at, and we also know what throttle position it's at, we can go into every single cell inside of a Power Commander or Bazaz and make the changes to get the correct air-fuel ratio. Now the correct air-fuel ratio doesn't always make the best power. So we'll tune everything to 13.2 to 1, and then I'll go back and look for power, make sure rideability is still good, turn on some advanced features in the Power Commander or the Bazaz that you may need. For example, the accelerator pump feature, so that whenever you give a big change of throttle position, it actually richens or leans the bike up for a given RPM so that it can climb up out of that hole and start getting back into the regular parts of the map. We're back at the whiteboard. I want to answer some of the questions that come up and also talk a little bit about the difference between flashing and tuning. Tuning involves some sort of way of changing the air-fuel ratio. We use a piggyback controller, either a Power Commander or Bazaz, and answer some of the most common questions that people ask me about, like quick shifters. So what a quick shifter is it interrupts the bike's acceleration to allow the transmission to go into the next gear without lifting the throttle. And an important thing about Power Commanders versus Bazaz, Bazaz goes to lower injectors, and then if your bike has what's called shower injectors up high, or secondary injectors, Bazaz goes to all of this, all of the injectors and the spark. That's why the Bazaz comes with the quick shifter and you don't have to buy anything else sometimes. So you press the gear shift lever, the sensor on the gear shift lever senses it, tells the Bazaz or the Power Commander to kill whatever it's controlling. On a Bazaz, it kills all of them. But on a Power Commander, you notice we're only hooked up to the bottom injectors. And the reason that Power Commander only hooks to the bottom injectors is because these are for acceleration and for bottom end, and then once you really start going, it goes up to bigger injectors on top. And it leaves a lot of what's called duty cycle in the bottom injectors, meaning they're not working as hard as the top. So if you need to add fuel or subtract fuel, you can use those without going over the duty cycle, meaning making them work too hard. But if you have a quick shifter and you're at 100% throttle and nearing red line and you kill these bottom injectors, the top injectors are going to keep going and it's not going to work. It works, but not great. So if you have a power commander and you're going to install a quick shifter, you have to install some other device. And these get connected together so that they talk. But you can get things like a secondary fuel module, which hooks to the second set of injectors. Or you can get a QEM, which is a quick shift expansion module, which hooks to the second injectors. Or my favorite, an ignition module. And what the ignition module does is it hooks up to the coils, which are controlling your spark plugs. So just like a power commander, with the ignition module, you can actually adjust timing forward and back at given RPMs, at given throttle positions. And sometimes in the newer bikes, we can find a little bit more torque and a little bit more power by adding some timing. But with this setup, whenever the quick shift sensor signals the power commander, it tells the ignition module to kill spark. Without spark, bike stops accelerating and it goes into the next gear. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the difference between adding a piggyback fuel controller and flashing. We do a lot of flashing on Yamahas. Kawasaki's can get flashed. There's really not a need for GSXRs or Hondas to get flashed because they're not dumbed down. The controllers are good, and what it does is good. The fueling might not be right because you've made changes, but all you have to do is add a piggyback to those. But on Yamahas and Kawasaki's, the book is so wrong that it's easier just to change the book. So what happens with a flash, in its most simplest terms, is you get a new book. You get a really new, cool book that has a map built into it. So now, you may or may not need a power commander or a Bazaz. Because now all the information goes in the ECU, and since you have this new book, which has a map in it already, but again, it's the off-the-shelf map, but it may be good enough for your bike. I hate the words good enough, but it might be good enough for your bike. So reflashing, especially on Yamahas and Kawasaki's, because those two bikes are dumbed down in the ECU so much that reflashing them is a must prior to even putting a piggyback on it. You have to change this book. The Yamaha R1s from 09 up and the Yamaha R6s from 06 up are fly-by-wire. Meaning one of the things that it looks at is it looks at throttle position as normal, but it actually controls the throttle. You're not controlling the throttle. It is. This is a throttle blade at 100% throttle. So you say, give me 100% throttle, and your ECU says, no. Actually, you know what? That's going to be our next movie, is the difference in flashing and tuning. So, basics of Power Commander, Piggyback, Bazaz, any of the following, is a bunch of information goes in. ECU is going to determine how much spark and how much fuel to put in. On Yamahas, it actually controls the throttle. But because of this being wrong and the book being wrong, you have to add a piggyback to add or subtract more fuel or more spark. Thanks a lot. Ask any questions you want to in the comment section. I'll get to them as I can, as long as they're reasonable. And come by and see us. Pet my dog Afie and meet my staff and my crew. We also do trackside service for into track days and STT in the southeast. So you can come by and talk to me there also. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.